Hi, welcome to the very first episode of Akiona Law Podcast. My name is Lani Akiona, and I am the founding attorney of the family law and divorce firm Akiona Law. So today's podcast, we're going to be talking about spousal maintenance and basically what is spousal maintenance and maintenance, how do you get it? But before we dive into our very first podcast episode here at Akiona Law, our special guest today is our very own Catherine Peterson. Catherine, welcome to the Akiona Law podcast. And before we start discussing spousal maintenance in Washington, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself? You have a really interesting background about how you came into family law and how you came into being an attorney, and I just love hearing about it. So please share that with us. And what do you go by again? I'm sorry, Catherine, or I want to call you Katie.
Yeah, thanks. I do go by Katie, and thank you for having me today. And I do have a different. I got into this work in a different way. So I was a stay-at-home mom for several years. I have 4 children, and my youngest was getting ready to go to school, and I was starting to look and figure out what I was going to do. And my neighbor is a family law, or was at that time a family law attorney, and she told me about a program through the Bar Association uh, in um, in Washington, where you study and intern for 4 years, and you can take the bar exam and become an attorney without going to law school. So that was the route I went. It took me a little bit longer between taking some time off during and before and after preparing for the bar exam. So I did that, and I have now been an attorney for 9 years. I've worked exclusively in family law, and that's my story.
And how many years were you a family law and divorce paralegal?
That was for 6 years. So I've been in family law now for 15 years.
And that was when you worked in for the attorney, that was up here in Everett, right?
It was, yes. I've always worked in Everett.
And Katie, you and I have discussed this a lot because family law is very unique. It has its own special set of challenges, and it has its ups and downs. But you and I discussed like with such a rewarding area of practice, and I personally can't see myself doing anything else. What do you find so enjoyable about family law and divorce?
Well, first of all, it's always interesting. Every day is different. Everybody's story is different. I love hearing people's stories. That really is I would say, one of the most rewarding parts. Obviously, helping people who are in distress and in crisis, seeing seeing good results come from our work. The other thing that I really enjoy about family law is being able to resolve matters outside of court so that people can go on and have
Yeah.
reasonable relationships going forward that are not destructive to their children, are not destructive to their own mental health. So, and really being able to come up with creative solutions to difficult
Exactly.
problems without having to run into court and beat each other up.
Right. And I think that's and I think that's my favorite part about family law. You and I often will have case strategy discussions where we're trying to come up with creative solutions to resolve cases without having to go to court because, you and I have been doing this for a while, and we know that going to court is sometimes not the best resort. And if people can come to solutions outside of court themselves, that's always the best way.
Yes.
All right, let's discuss spousal maintenance. That's what this first podcast episode is about. So spousal maintenance is also called alimony, but in Washington we don't call it alimony. We call it spousal maintenance. We can also refer to it as spousal support. So Katie, I know you've done a lot of financial cases, particularly dealing with issues with spousal maintenance, division of assets and debts. So let's dive into, I'm sure people are dying to know, how do I get spousal maintenance? What factors does the court look at? Can you discuss about that?
Yes. So the first thing about spousal maintenance to know is that there's no schedule, there's no set amount, there's no set duration. It is discretionary based that the judges get to decide. Um, when you're looking at a spousal maintenance award, first of all, you may be looking at temporary spousal maintenance, which would be typically either for a specific amount of time, or it would go until final orders were entered, and that may or may not change the amount or duration. Um, the
Can I pause you right here? I'm gonna ask a question that I'm sure people are wondering. Now, you mentioned there's no set schedule for spousal maintenance. What do you mean by that?
I mean, in child support, to calculate child support, you take each party's income, you plug them into a formula, and out pops a number of child support. And it's cut and dry. The legislature has decided it. You can't really argue about it much. There are a few factors that you could use maybe to lower it or increase it. But for the most part, it's a schedule, and the courts follow it. Spousal maintenance isn't like that. Spousal maintenance has several factors that the court looks at. One of the factors
Well,
is
let me just stop you. So you're saying there is like child support, right? Like you're just talking about they have the child support schedule, you plug in the incomes, but there's nothing like that with spousal maintenance, right? There's no like schedule. Well, if I was married for X number of years and my husband makes X amount and I don't make anything, I can plug it in and this will tell me how much spousal maintenance I get. That there's nothing like that exists, right?
That's correct.
Okay. So then I'm sorry, like again, I'm trying to think of questions that people would ask as they're listening to this. And so if there's not a set schedule, you were talking about the court looks at different factors for awarding spousal maintenance. So let's get into some of those factors that the court will look at.
So the factors that the court looks at are not exclusionary, which means the court really can look at whatever it wants to in terms of any types of facts that are relevant to spousal maintenance. The court can look at. However, the statute does list several factors that the court should look at and does look at. The first one is the financial resources of the party seeking maintenance. So that basically means what does the spouse who is asking for maintenance, what are their resources? What is their income? What property have they been awarded in the case? For instance, a party may have zero income, but may have received a huge amount of property in the divorce, and the court may say you don't need maintenance because of the property that you've received. That's a possibility.
Okay, so the first one factor was the financial resources of the party seeking maintenance, right?
Yes. The second issue is the ability of the party seeking maintenance to be self-supporting. So, for instance, some people choose not to work, which is a choice that they can make, but the court typically would expect somebody to work to their ability and to earn to their ability. And when they decide the amount and duration of spousal maintenance, the court will take that into account.
Okay, and that second factor again was the party's ability to be self-sufficient. The party
Yes.
seeking maintenance, right? Okay.
Yes. The third factor is the time and education needed for the party seeking maintenance to become self-supporting. So if a party has been, for instance, a stay-at-home parent for several years, doesn't have an education or much of a work history, but has a good plan for going back to school and getting a job that's going to be able to support themselves, the court will typically often, depending on the length of the marriage and the resources of the party paying maintenance, but they will often give that spouse time to be able to get their education and get their feet under them and get a job that is going to allow them to be self-supporting.
Okay, so to summarize, the third factor in possibly getting an award of spousal maintenance is if I were a stay-at-home mom and let's say I needed to go back to school to get some retraining or recertification, I could possibly get spousal maintenance to help me cover that cost.
That's correct. Then the next factor that the court looks is the standard of living that the parties enjoyed during their marriage. So, for instance, spousal maintenance isn't limited necessarily to your exact bottom bargain basement budget. If the parties had a lifestyle that included lavish cars, lavish vacations, an expensive house. You know, the court can award maintenance to the party who is requesting maintenance that is more than what more than a minimum budget that party would be able to eat and clothe themselves, for instance. So the standard of living is something that the court takes into account when awarding spousal maintenance.
You know, I want to pause on this one. So the summary, right? You can also, another factor in awarding spousal maintenance is the standard of living that the parties had during the marriage. And I remember I read, you know, I'm going to geek out. I read a case about this. It was so fascinating because the husband who was appealing the court's decision of the award of spousal maintenance, the husband was arguing against the fact that the court took into consideration in the spousal maintenance award to the wife that the wife was getting her nails done and she was getting massages and she was getting these beauty treatments. And he's like, no, that's not what spousal maintenance is for. And the court said, well, that was a standard of living during the marriage. And that standard of living shall continue. And of course, you know, and of course, we're talking about like high income sort of couples, right? Where the people can afford that type of stuff and those types of luxuries or things. And I remember thinking, wow, that's just so fascinating that if you're in the standard of lifestyle where you use, you know, you're stay-at-home mom, your husband works for Microsoft, you know, is a big wig at Microsoft, whatever, and you're able to enjoy getting these pedicures and manicures and getting facial treatments and things like that, that upon the divorce, a court found, okay, well, no, you can still continue that standard of living because you, husband, can afford it. And that was a lifestyle you established during your marriage. That was a lifestyle you gave your wife, and your wife shall continue to enjoy that lifestyle. Yeah, I just thought that was so fascinating. But unfortunately, right, I'm not in that position to be. I think it's hard for a lot of people to enjoy that standard of living. I think that was more for that upper echelon of those high income wage earners.
So
Go ahead,
the next factor that the court looks at is the duration of marriage. And the duration of marriage certainly can impact the amount of spousal maintenance, but it is has much more impact on the duration of spousal maintenance. So for instance, there's no set schedule for how spousal maintenance is the duration of spousal maintenance. But in a long-term marriage, the court can and sometimes does order lifetime maintenance. That's very unusual, but in a very long-term marriage, that is a possibility. Typically in that situation, the court's more likely to divide property in order to equalize the parties' financial positions going forward. But the court can order lifetime maintenance in that situation. In a short-term marriage, typically the court doesn't order spousal maintenance, and if they do, it's typically for a very short period of time. So the duration of the marriage definitely impacts the duration of child support or of spousal maintenance.
Okay, so then the other factor that the court looks at, again, just to summarize, is that the length of marriage is an important factor for the court to consider in awarding spousal maintenance. And I've always thought about it as that the shorter your marriage is, the less likely you are to get spousal maintenance. But the longer your marriage is, it's because my understanding is that the community has just built up this time together. And when the community dissolves, the marital community, the court is really seeking to put parties on equal footing post-divorce, especially in those long-term marriages. So I always think that's kind of unique in that sense that to me, it just makes sense in terms of equity. The less, the duration of marriage should play a factor in the award of spousal maintenance, with the less the marriage is, and in terms of length, be it 1 year marriage compared to a 25-year marriage, that the spousal maintenance dependent on that as well. So have you dealt with it? Hey, have you dealt, I don't think I've asked you this before, but have you dealt with any cases where you've seen a lifetime spousal maintenance award or where parties agree to it?
I have not. I've seen several that go up to retirement age, but typically they do end at retirement age. Usually 67 is about the outside.
Yeah, same here. I feel like I've only seen those lifetime maintenance awards when it's come out in case law, and it's because one of those parties had some sort of serious illness the party receiving spousal maintenance, and their income was just so limited that the court felt that justice and equity based on the length of marriage and that person's health predicated a lifetime spousal maintenance award. Okay, so let's go. Thanks, Katie. Let's go on to the next factor. Hey, what's the next factor that the court considers in awarding spousal maintenance?
The next factor is the age, physical, and emotional condition, and the financial obligations of the party seeking maintenance. So, for instance, if the party is has a physical disability or has emotional issues that prevent them from working, the court will take that into account when deciding the amount and duration of spousal maintenance. The court can would also take into account how those factors impact that spouse's ability to work and earn an income as well.
Okay, so in summary, another factor in spousal maintenance the court is looking at the party who wants spousal maintenance, looking at that person's age. Are they in their 30s, or are they capable of going out and getting a job, or are they 65? What's their physical health like? What's their emotional health like? And that kind of ties in how we're talking about in that case where the court awarded lifetime spousal maintenance. One of the things the courts considered was not only the duration of the marriage, but the factor we just talked about was the age of the party and that person's physical health as well, because a person was a lot older and their health was poor, that it will kind of compounded into the court's award of that lifetime spousal maintenance, which again, you or I haven't actually seen yet in our experience with court. But it's out there. There's case law that supports that award based on the factors that we've been discussing. So what's the next factor, Katie, in a spousal maintenance award?
The last factor is the ability of the spouse from whom maintenance is being asked for to meet their own financial obligations while paying the spousal maintenance.
I like this one because a lot of people forget about this factor. Go ahead.
So what we call this is the ability to pay. So the person's ability to pay is also a factor. So lots of times in divorces, there just isn't enough money to go around. Neither spouse is going to be able to pay all of their bills, pay their rent, and continue on. And most of the time, neither spouse is going to be able to continue on in the same lifestyle that they had during the relationship. It's moving from one household to two households usually results in less money to go around. So the court does look at the person who's being requested to pay maintenance, looks at what they actually need in order to continue to maintain their obligations in determining what their maintenance obligation is going to be to their former spouse.
Right. And I consider this last factor need versus ability to pay, where, a person may have the need for spousal maintenance, but you have to look at, well, what does the other party have the ability to pay? What can they afford? And I love, using that factor when you have the other side, maybe who's representing the wife, and they have this exorbitant spousal maintenance request that's pretty much taking up all the husband's income. And then it's like, wait, but you've also got to address the fact that she may have the need for the spousal maintenance, but he doesn't have the ability to pay her $5,000 because he's only taking home $6,000. So if he pays her $5,000, he's not going to have any money to pay for his own living expenses. He's not going to have money to pay for his food. He's not going to have money to pay for his utilities, things like that. So those are really, that last factor I personally love, because again, you may have a need for spousal maintenance, but if you can't prove that the other side can pay that requested spousal maintenance, then you're not going to win on a spousal maintenance argument. Because like, as you said, when people split up, that does reduce the money coming in, because now you've got two different households to support. The party who's paying the spousal maintenance has to also afford his own rent and his own living expenses. So thanks, Katie. Well, that's it. That's it for our very first podcast episode of Acciona Law, discussing spousal maintenance and the factors that go into a spousal maintenance award with Acciona Law family law and divorce attorney Kati Peterson. And again, here at Akiona Law, the point of this podcast is meant to answer any type of questions you have about family law and divorce. So if you have some suggested topics that you want to hear about concerning issues of family law or concerning the issues of divorce, please go ahead and let us know. Share your comments with us. Until next time, stay safe and be healthy. Hi, I'm Lani Akiona of Akiona Law. Welcome to the Akiona Law podcast. This podcast is for questions that have to do with the area of family law and divorce. If you listened to our first podcast, you'll recall that I interviewed our very own Kati Peterson, who works for Akiona Law, and we talked to her about the different factors that the court looks at in awarding spousal maintenance. Now, in Washington, spousal maintenance is also known as alimony or spousal support, but in Washington, the formal legal the legal term is called spousal maintenance, but it's the same thing: spousal maintenance, alimony, and spousal support. So we're going to continue our discussion about spousal maintenance today with attorney Katherine Peterson. And let's just dive right into it, Kati. So last podcast, we talked about the different factors that the court had, um, the different factors the court looked at in awarding spousal maintenance. Now, if you wouldn't mind just kind of recapping those factors again for us, please.
So the factors in awarding spousal maintenance are the party who's seeking maintenance's need, so their actual financial resources that they have, their income, and the property that they've received in the divorce. Their ability to be self-sufficient without the assistance, the time and education needed for the party to become who's seeking maintenance to become self-sufficient, the standard of living that was enjoyed during the marriage is also a factor, as well as the duration of the marriage, the age, physical and emotional condition, and financial obligations of the party seeking maintenance, and the ability of the party who's being requested to pay maintenance is that party's ability to pay their own financial obligations while paying maintenance.
All right. Thank you for Kati for doing a very brief summary of the factors in awarding spousal maintenance. And if you want to hear more about that, listen to our very first podcast, episode 1, where we dive into the factors awarding spousal maintenance. So moving forward, went to court with my fabulous attorney here at Akiona Law, and we got an award of spousal maintenance. But now my spouse is not paying my spousal maintenance, and this has happened. This is not new. This comes up. So, Kati, let's talk about what happens if a party has got spousal maintenance, and we're talking about temporary spousal maintenance or maybe even a final spousal maintenance order. What happens if the other party doesn't pay? What are the remedies available?
So the first thing to do usually in that situation is to send a letter to either the party if they're not represented or to their attorney, reminding them that spousal maintenance is due, and see if that resolves the problem. Sometimes it does, and sometimes it doesn't. Um, the remedy that you have in court is to file a motion for contempt. That requires.
Let me pause you right there for a second. Now, you and I had previously discussed that it's always, the thing that we like about family law is that we're always trying to come up with creative solutions to resolve things for our clients without having to go to court. So, in terms of the party not paying spousal maintenance, is that something that, in terms of the letter, right? Are we talking about that's part of that creative solution where we're trying to fix things without having to spend that time and money going to court?
Yes, it's always makes sense to see if you can resolve something without going to court. It might be that the other party just needs their attorney to remind them about what this possible consequences of not paying maintenance is, and sometimes that solves the problem quickly. Sometimes the spouse who's supposed to be paying maintenance is just a bit irresponsible and is not and just isn't taking care of their bills and just needs a little nudge.
A little
and
nudge.
sometimes that resolves it.
Yeah.
Sometimes the spouse who is not paying because they're extremely difficult, hostile, angry about the divorce, and has no intention of paying, and that certainly happens sometimes. And in those situations, usually it does require a motion for contempt.
Okay. So then the first step that we talked about is, write a letter. have your attorney. And the reason why, you can most certainly send your spouse a reminder, but lots of times they just ignore it. But when they see that letter from the attorney or that email from the attorney and it has the letterhead, then somehow it just kind of clicks something. So the first suggestion, if your spouse isn't paying spousal maintenance, is get your family law divorce attorney or attorney you trust to send them a nicely worded but strong letter reminding them of their spousal maintenance obligation and their ability to pay and what can happen if they don't pay. So that would be your first suggestion. Send a letter. And then your next suggestion that you talked about, and unfortunately, you talked about a motion for contempt. What is that?
So you file a motion in court. In order to do that, you have to request an order to show cause from the commissioner, which means that the commissioner is basically signing an order requiring the person who you are looking to hold in contempt to come to court and explain why he or she should not be required to follow the court's order. So that has to be personally served on the other party, which sometimes can be a difficult process and time consuming. And then the other party has an opportunity to respond. So in order to be found in contempt, the other party has to be
Well,
found.
let's back up a little bit. Motion for contempt, right? I mean, a lot of people aren't familiar with that term. What exactly is a motion for contempt?
Well, it's a motion where you explain to the court what the court order says and how the other party has failed to obey that order. And
Yeah.
so you
Well, I
have to
like that
have.
part. The motion for contempt is that you have, Your Honor, I have this court order in place. This court order says that he's supposed to pay me $1,000 a month in spousal maintenance, and he hasn't paid that, Your Honor. So he's in contempt of the court order because he's not following it.
Yes.
Now, in terms of motion for contempt, and we've seen this happen, what is your the question I'm trying to ask is, when is it appropriate to file a motion for contempt? For example, because he missed one spousal maintenance?
And
When,
oftentimes clients say he was 5 days late, and last month he was 10 days late to pay his spousal maintenance. And usually our response to that is, I know that that's frustrating and annoying, but the court is probably not going to find him in contempt for being 5 or 10 days late. And even if they do find him in contempt, it's probably not going to give you any, it's not going to help you that much. If he's paying within the month, usually I would say it's not worth going to court for contempt if that's happening.
Unless you see this definite pattern where you can see that spouse knows that the wife's rent payment is due on the 5th, and then he's deliberately paying, and his court orders to pay maintenance on the 1st, right? So she can make the payment on the 5th, the rent payment, but instead for the past 10 months, he's been paying it on the 10th. I kind of feel like in that situation, you have this history of showing it's in bad faith, especially if she sends him reminders. That's what I always tell people. That's what we tell people: create the paper trail. Show that you told this spouse that, hey, reminder, your maintenance payment is due on the 1st, my rent is due on the 5th, but yet you keep on sending it to me on the 10th. Stop doing that. You're messing up my rent payment. Okay.
So if you do file a motion for contempt and your spouse does not have an attorney, the court can appoint an attorney to represent him. And the reason for that is that a possible remedy for contempt is actually jail time. So, and it is extremely unusual for the court to send somebody to jail for failure to pay spousal maintenance, but it does happen.
Yeah. And our trick for getting around that, because that happened to me once, I'm like, why is this guy get this free attorney on a motion for contempt? And I realized, oh crap, I asked for jail time. So that's a tip. Do not ask for jail time on a motion for contempt on spousal maintenance, because your spouse will get a free attorney, and you don't want that. You do not want that. Don't ask for jail time. And you don't want him to go to jail anyway, because then he can't pay you. Okay. I know. So we talked about, so the first step in emotion, what do I do, right? My spouse isn't paying me spousal maintenance. First, send a letter. The next, if you can file a motion for contempt, it does require some legal steps. You have to go to court. You have to get an order to show cause, which basically tells your spouse you have to appear in court on X date and to explain to the court why you're not paying spousal maintenance. Then that has to be personally served on the other side. And what are some ways that personal service can be accomplished in serving this
Uh,
motion for contempt to your spouse?
so typically you can hire a professional process server, and that's one way to get them served. Also, any other adult other than yourself is qualified to serve somebody. So it doesn't you don't have to pay somebody. If you have a friend or a relative who can take care of it, that is another way to serve your spouse for this.
Right. And you made an important note there. You just cannot serve your spouse yourself.
Correct.
That is a no-no because you're an interested party and parties cannot serve each other. Things like motion for contempts.
Correct.
So we're moving forward. Then we talked about filing a motion for contempt. And so what are the things that you have to show what are the things that you would have to show in your motion for contempt?
Well, you have to show that there was a court order and that the other party failed to follow the court order. And you have to provide evidence of that. Um, and you also have to show the court that the failure to follow the court order was in bad faith.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, if your spouse had a job where he or she was making, say, $10,000 a month, and your spousal maintenance award was, say, $3,000 a month, and your spouse loses his job and is now collecting $2,500 a month in unemployment and stops paying you spousal support, the court is unlikely to find his failure to follow that court order to be in bad faith. Now, there's obviously other factors where that could be the case, but
Mm-hmm.
in those specific circumstances, if the spouse no longer has any ability to pay the spousal maintenance, the court is probably not going to be finding the failure to pay to be in bad faith.
So what would be a good example if you've had a spouse that was making, say, 10 grand and now he's only making $2,000? What would be a factor in the court finding that that drop in income was in bad faith?
Well, if that person had quit his job voluntarily for no reason, that would be something. If that person had been fired from his job for some bad behavior, such as stealing or maybe getting a DUI or some sort of behavior like that, it's possible that the court may still find that to be in bad faith. The other factor that a court could look at is just because that party's income has dropped precipitously, that doesn't necessarily mean he doesn't still have $100,000 sitting in the bank that was part of his divorce settlement, and that he still does have the ability to pay during this time when he's not working. And it's possible that this person's job history and is that's how their job always is they're employed for a period of time, then they're unemployed for a period of time, then they're maybe they have a contract and they go back to work, and that was anticipated when the spousal maintenance award was either agreed to or ordered by the court. And so therefore the court is not going to give them a break.
Yeah, and that's a really important distinction. There's a really big difference in terms of, because that's, I mean, to have a finding of contempt where the court finds, yes, you party violated this order and your violation of the court order was in bad faith. That's basically what we're talking about here. But there's a difference between, well, husband can't pay the maintenance because it was COVID and he got laid off like a lot of other people do. That's not bad faith because that's outside his control. Versus you've got this vindictive husband who says, I don't want to pay you the spousal maintenance anymore. I'm going to quit my job as this Microsoft executive and I'm going to work at McDonald's. Yeah.
And even though that seems so crazy that it would happen, it does happen sometimes. It happens actually a lot more often than you would expect.
And I don't get that because it's like, you're not off the hook. You're still going to have to pay. You can't outsmart the court. um, Okay, so is there anything else in terms of that motion for contempt process that you feel like people need to know about?
No, I think that we covered everything that's on for the basics.
The basics. So again, just to kind of refresh here, the topic that we're talking about was basically what are the remedies available to me if my spouse isn't paying his spousal maintenance? And the first remedy that we talked about was, send a letter. That's kind of like the most cheapest remedy, right? Because you don't want to be spending a whole bunch of money going to court, and especially if it's something like he lost his job because of COVID, right? You're not going to, like Katie was talking about, the court's not going to find that job loss and his failure to pay spousal maintenance in bad faith. So first is to send a letter, because it has happened where people are maybe just derelict or just not responsible, and they need that reminder, the nudge. And the second remedy that you talked about is, I mean, it's only two options. It's write a letter or go to court on a motion for contempt.
Yes.
And I think in terms of the motion for contempt, I think one thing you talked about is, well, sometimes maybe the party doesn't have the ability to pay the maintenance. So the question then goes, well, then why should I go to court and get this, hire an attorney and spend money on a motion for contempt if my husband can't afford, if my ex-husband can't afford to pay because he lost his job because of COVID. So now I'm in this holding pattern. Why would someone still want to, I guess, file a motion for contempt? What would be the remedy on that?
You could, if you wanted to do that, you could possibly still get a judgment
Mm-hmm.
um, for the unpaid spousal maintenance that could be collected on at a later date. That would be one possible reason to do that. I could see that as being a possible
Right.
reason to take that action. You don't have to file a motion for contempt in order to get a judgment, though. You can just file a motion for a judgment for the unpaid maintenance as well. You don't have to. You don't have to actually to go through all the hoops of a motion for contempt to get there.
Ah, I see. So you would do instead, so that's a third possibility. File a motion for judgment. Because what it has to do, right, what you're talking about is that attorney strategy. What's the best strategy for you client in this situation? If someone lost their job because of COVID, is a letter going to work? No. Right? Is a motion for contempt going to work? No. Why not? Well, because we can't prove that bad faith element. So then that third option would be, well, hey, what about just we can file? Okay, so what? It's been like 3 months, it's been 4 months. Okay, so let's do a motion for judgment, because then at least you get a judgment where the court gives you that dollar amount for that past due spousal maintenance that wasn't paid. You can tack on interest, and when he does start working again, then you have that judgment and you can take it to a collections agency, a collections attorney, and start collecting from his pay stub when he starts working against that back maintenance. So that's again, that's the fun part about family law, is that there's no one size fits all solution. You really need an experienced family law attorney like you and I. That's all we just do, is just family law and divorce, to really kind of flesh out the facts and think about what option, what case plan, what case strategy works best for that client and that situation and that particular set of facts. And to me, that's what makes family law really fun, wouldn't you say?
Yes, absolutely.
I love that. I feel like we just solved a problem right now without even realizing it. All right. Well, I thank you, Katie. And again, uh, just to wrap up, that was our discussion on spousal maintenance. What happens if my spouse doesn't pay? And thank you all for joining us on our second podcast of Akiona Law. We're here to answer any questions you have about family law and divorce. And if you've got some questions that you want us to address in the podcast, go ahead and put your suggestion down in our chat, and we love to hear from you. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
The information in this podcast is general advice only and should not in any respect be relied on as specific legal advice.